Howdy everyone, and welcome to the Serial Geek TV YouTube channel. My name is James Eatock, and today we're going to take a look at an animated series that saw the most unlikely of team-ups, in the production of the visuals that is. Back in 2007, having contributed to many of their Filmation DVD releases, BCI kindly sent me complimentary copies of the 2 released volumes of the New Adventures of Zorro, even though I hadn't actually worked on the sets. Being a Filmation fan, I had seen a clip or two of the show over the years, usually featuring the rotoscoped sword sequence, but I was in no great rush to watch the series. Part of the reason for my apprehension was that I am a huge fan of the Japanese animation studio Tokyo Movie Shinsha. Aware that they had been brought in to animate this series, I was not really looking forward to seeing this legendary animation company attempting to animate in the style of Filmation, as I thought them working within Filmation's stock system would hinder their talents. It wasn't actually until 2012 that I finally removed the cellophane wrapping from both DVD sets and watched the series. Whilst the introduction sequence was typically Filmation in both style and presentation, nothing could prepare me for the quality of animation featured in the episodes themselves. Let's just say that I was so impressed with the visuals, I wish I had unwrapped the DVDs back in 2007. But before I showcase some wonderful examples of the Tokyo Movie Shinsha Filmation team-up, I want to briefly explain how the New Adventures of Zorro came to be the first and only show that Filmation Studios had animated overseas. With numerous animation studios in America sending their work overseas, Filmation were rightfully proud of the fact that since opening for business, they had successfully managed to keep all facets of animation production within the United States, even though it was expensive. However, in the early 80s, Filmation were faced with a limited amount of time in which to complete the numerous shows that were in production. This was primarily down to the fact that the networks were delaying their approval on a majority of story premises and scripts. Having hired as many extra staff as they could, Filmation knew that the New Adventures of Zorro was going to miss the delivery date, and begrudgingly, for the first time in the company's history, a show would have to be animated overseas. Tokyo Movie Shinsha, a Japanese studio with an incredibly rich and well-respected history, were chosen to animate the 13 episodes of The New Adventures of Zorro. Even though Filmation head Lou Scheimer wasn't a fan of the fact that they had to outsource, many of the creative talent at Filmation were looking forward to the end result, as they were more than familiar with the quality of Tokyo Movie Shinsha's Japanese-produced shows. Filmation producer Don Christensen was sent to oversee production of the animation, with the first episode having to be delivered 5 weeks after the agreement between the studios was made. Filmation sent TMS a great deal of reference material in order for them to animate the show in the Filmation style. Filmation had always managed to keep production costs of their show within budget by creating a stock system of character animation sequences. However, when watching this series, it soon becomes apparent that Tokyo Movie Shinsha had their own ideas when it came to animating a Filmation production. Although there are more than a few pieces of Filmation-style rotoscoped animation in the series, there is much lighter stock system in place, with many of the episodes consisting of entirely new animation. And as there is no stock system in place, there are no predetermined angles that the director has to obey, leading to a great visual freedom. Tokyo Movie Shinsha's work on the series is much like Toei's work during the same year on the shows Spider-Man and Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. Both Japanese studios were given the task of animating a westernized production, and both succeeded in making the end result stand out. Filmation's association with TMS allowed the Japanese studio to gain a foothold in the US market, contributing to the increasing trend of having animation produced overseas in order to reduce costs. Ironically, Filmation, the studio that had previously celebrated its US-based animation output, played a small part in the slow demise of the very same homegrown industry it had been trying to protect. That said, The New Adventures of Zorro is a wonderful example of 2 studios with very different attitudes towards the animation process, working together and creating something very special. And now I shall endeavour to showcase some fine examples of how Tokyo Movie Shinsha took a Filmation product in The New Adventures of Zorro and ran with it. From the opening moments of the first episode, 3 as a Crowd, it is apparent that much of the show's animation is unique, and that even though there are moments of Filmation's traditional rotoscoped style in place, Tokyo Movie Shinsha presents it in such a way that it isn't jarring. One of the things about Filmation's rotoscope system is that on more than one occasion the timing of the sequence would present the animation in such a way that it looked either too slow or too fast, depending on how the director had timed it. Here, TMS times the rotoscoped animation perfectly, with some frames being timed much faster than others. The Japanese studio's style is showcased to perfection when Zorro's sidekick Miguel leaps into the water. Not only is the character animation rendered incredibly well, with more frames shot of the actual arc of the dive, but the splash of water reveals their attention to detail, illustrating a beautifully realistic splash. One has only to look at the He-Man and the Masters of the Universe episode A Beastly Sideshow to see that normally Filmation crowd scenes were nothing to write home about. However, in this shot we can see that the artist has given us detailed and unique character designs, and this style of unique character design continues to delight us throughout the episode, as we can see when a lone sailor is interrogated. One of the interesting things about certain shots in this series is that characters perform double and triple eye blinks, something that director Tom Tataranaouis would later introduce into his directing of episodes of She-Ra to make the characters a little more real. In the second episode Flash Flood, we see Captain Ramon dramatically enter the scene during a storm. To convey his intensity and threat, we see a somewhat cliched flash of lightning. On this occasion, and thanks to Tokyo Movie Shinsha's involvement, we are treated to a wonderfully painted and incredibly threatening sky for a few frames. The level of detail which the artists have put into this seemingly unimportant shot is impressive. 3 different images are utilised to showcase the lightning of the oncoming storm as well as the heavy rainfall. When Miguel is duelling with 2 of Sergeant Gonzalez's officers, we not only see a sequence of exciting animation, but we also see a great deal of reality brought to the action. During the fight, Miguel leaps over the oncoming swish of a sword and onto the edge of a well. The frames of Miguel are illustrated with such detail that when he leaps onto the edge of the well, he has to adjust his balance, even looking back to make sure he's not about to fall in. When this particular officer looks upward, we can see lines under his chin to indicate shading. This technique of illustration was commonplace in Japanese animation at the time. 2 fantastically directed and animated shots show Zorro dueling with Captain Ramon and Miguel dueling with 3 of Ramon's officers. Not only are the character movements as convincing as ever, but the water on the right behind the dam that they duel on is animated with ripples to further showcase the realism of the rain. At the beginning of the episode The Blockade, we see early examples of why Tokyo Movie Shinsha were known for animating some of the most beautifully rendered explosions in the world of animation. These shots also highlight just how much more detailed the Japanese studio's work was over Filmation's, whose explosions for the most part were animated rather simply in their numerous action-based shows of the time. Filmation would rarely ever use speed lines to stylize the quick movement of a background, but Tokyo Movie Shinsha execute it to perfection with this wonderful sequence of Zorro and Miguel racing into action. The trick with speed lines is that in certain instances they have to be representative of the background itself, and thankfully that is the case here. Another technique that is employed in the series is two-tone shading. This was always quite costly for Filmation as the effect was a lengthy process. Tokyo Movie Shinsha paint the cells in 2 tones on certain scenes to create both depth and believability, whereas Filmation would often underexpose the shot in certain areas to create the shadows. Although no doubt based on a Filmation character design, the way in which the child is illustrated and animated throughout the episode The Frame is different to the way in which Filmation would usually present them. The stylisation of the boy's features has him sporting much larger eyes than typical Filmation child characters. A wonderfully short but beautifully animated shot shows both Zorro and Miguel back to back dueling with Captain Ramon's officers on a bridge. Although the sequence is brief, it is wonderfully complex, fantastically detailed and incredibly well directed. In this sequence, Zorro dodges the point of a sword before blocking both thrusting swords. We also see some lines of movement put to good use as the swords, known for their flexibility, flip back from Zorro's defense. While all of this occurs, in the background Miguel is animated dueling with one officer. The animation of Zorro throwing his sword out of shot with a rope attached is fantastic. At first, Zorro flips the blade into his hand, showcasing a wonderful use of lines to convey motion. As Zorro prepares to throw the sword, he strikes an impressively heroic pose, showing a physical line of motion, which continues through to the moment he has thrown the sword. From the beginning of the episode Turnabout, it appears as if Tokyo Movie Shinsha had their best group of animators working on this particular episode. Right from the moment the episode begins, we see incredibly stylized and expressively fluid movements, suggesting that TMS are happily avoiding the westernized style of presentation. Over and over again in this opening scene we see many examples of fantastically crafted animation as the character Mario evades capture whilst dueling with numerous officers. Not one single piece of animation here is stock or based on an animation sequence from a previous episode. A wonderfully action-packed sequence at night shows Miguel dueling two officers with a great deal of kinetic movement. A lot of the character animation is somewhat exaggerated, like the fight scenes in a comic book, but the actual sword fighting is impressive, showing Miguel's proficiency with the blade. A superb action scene shows Mario dueling with an outlaw atop a stagecoach. The animation of the sword fight is up to Tokyo Movie Shinsha's high standard, but the excitement of the scene is fueled by the fact that the coach they are fighting on moves up and down as it traverses the rough terrain. When Zorro and Captain Ramon duel later in the episode, aside from the fantastic animation of the sword fight, the shadow under Ramon is stylistically animated to great effect. It is illustrated in such a way that it appears to be a constant curve that reacts to his every movement. When Captain Ramon's prisoners reveal themselves to be his own armed officers, we see the group of them leap into battle. Whilst this is a great piece of animation, a comical addition shows one of the men at the back begin to run before falling over almost immediately, only to regain his footing a few frames later. Mario duels two men, and in quick succession of wonderfully animated frames we see him duck one blade whilst holding onto his hat, and then leap over another blade whilst kicking the sword out of one of the other attacker's hands. He then whips his sword around and removes the sword from the remaining attacker. A beautiful piece of animation shows Miguel dueling with three officers by the cliff. The non-stop ferocity of their attack drives him ever closer to the cliff edge. The action is highlighted by the fact that there are no static frames whatsoever in this shot, as is pretty much the case with every fight scene in this episode. The next sequence features some truly un-Filmation-like character design and animation. When Mario begins to overpower the officers, one realises that he has been bested, shrugs his shoulders and leaps into the water. The expressions on his face show Japanese character animation at its finest with regards to both takes and style. Three officers relentlessly charge towards the camera, and again we see that these designs would never appear in a Filmation cartoon, as the style is far too unique, most notably showcased by the man leading the charge. Upon inspection of the frames we can see that not only are his teeth illustrated almost individually, but the roof of his mouth is also given a great deal of detail. After Zorro has slashed all of their braces, we see a rather hilarious animated sequence in which they all realise that their trousers are about to fall down. Again, the expressions and movements show Japanese character animation at its finest, as the three men desperately attempt to keep their trousers up. As one of the men falls over, the other two react with overly comical faces and movement, with one of the men hoisting up his trousers above his waistline. This one sequence, due to its stylisation and overly comical expressions, would never have appeared in the New Adventures of Zorro had Filmation animated it themselves. We see a great deal of detailed animation in the episode The Trap, especially in the scene in which a castle that Zorro and Miguel are exploring begins to crumble before eventually falling into the sea that borders it. Once more, the level of detail in these sequences are far beyond anything that Filmation were creating at the time. A little look at the storyboard for this episode really does show the different approaches between the two studios. Filmation referenced a piece of Tarzan stock for the shot of Miguel diving into the water, meaning that if produced in-house, the animator would have located the line art and traced the exact same movement. However, Tokyo Movie Shinsha, with no stock system to adhere to, animated the shot in their own unique way. The following scene features some of the most beautiful character animation in the series, as both Zorro and Miguel attempt to scale a cliff face. We see Zorro and Miguel hanging onto branches which always seem to conveniently protrude from cliff faces in cartoons. While the animation of the pair hanging onto their respective branches is incredibly realistic, it is the acrobatical displays by both men that really makes this a highly memorable sequence. A comical piece of animation has Miguel beautifully flip backwards up onto the branch, immediately lose his balance and nearly fall backwards before performing a wonderfully typical Japanese comedy animation take as he desperately grabs onto the branch with both hands for dear life. Meanwhile, Zorro begins to spin around his branch. As Zorro begins to spin, we see a wonderfully animated close-up of Miguel's legs as he begins to bounce on the branch. Upon first inspection, it appears that the frames are just repeating, but a second look reveals that each bounce is uniquely animated, with wonderful lines of action being added to each point of impact. We then see Miguel grab onto Zorro's legs as the pair spin around. With each spin, Zorro's cape ever so slightly catches the branch. The way in which Miguel is animated is beautiful because the arch of his body shows his weight and movement in order to gain momentum as he prepares to leap upwards. The way in which the pair land atop the cliff is fantastic, with Miguel in an almost over-the-top fashion landing rather flamboyantly, and Zorro landing in the foreground moments later, with action lines once again used to indicate the point of impact. In this scene from The Takeover, which takes place in a cavern, an outside light source prompts Tokyo Movie Shinsha to once again employ shadows to dramatic effect. Later in the episode, we see an incredibly detailed and well animated shot of horses' hooves racing across the land as the ground, which is timed faster than the cells of the horse, races by. Mysterious Traveller, the final episode of the series, features Senorita Ruiz as a prominent character in the story. Although Tokyo Movie Shinsha attempt to follow Filmation's model sheet as closely as possible, the rendering of her character and other females in the series is actually not as nice as Filmation's ability to illustrate women. This can be attributed to the fact that Tokyo Movie Shinsha were animating many frames of female characters, whereas Filmation would animate far less but focus strongly on making sure characters remained on model throughout. Before the climactic battle at the end of the episode, we see an extremely confident Miguel appear and snap his sword into place. As the sword whips across the screen, it creates a gleam that, while not as beautifully animated as others in the series, is still incredibly well rendered. Oddly, halfway through the final episode of the series, one true piece of Filmation animation makes itself rather blatantly known. It is a wonderfully animated piece of rotoscoped footage that would not look out of place in an episode of He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. Towards the end of the episode, there is a wonderfully minor but striking piece of animation in which Zorro stands face to face with Captain Ramon. His sword is pointed downwards, but using its flexibility to his advantage, he pushes down on it and releases his grip, causing it to flip upwards into the air and confidently into his hand. This brief piece of animation truly shows just how every little detail was important to Tokyo Movie Shinsha. There's no doubt that in the hands of Filmation, the New Adventures of Zorro would have been just another show in their heavy output of animation during the late 70s and early 80s. However, the involvement of Tokyo Movie Shinsha means that aside from its obvious visual advantages, it is a unique production in so many ways. At one point, whilst writing the script for this video essay, I did begin to wonder what it would have been like had Tokyo Movie Shinsha worked on a more prominent Filmation production, such as He-Man and the Masters of the Universe or She-Ra, Princess of Power. I think the truth is, regardless of the high quality product that the Japanese studio were able to deliver in 13 episodes, shows with a 65 episode season would have presented them with a challenge, and as a result, Filmation's lengthier shows would have endured what many cartoons of the 80s suffered from: inconsistent quality across the series. For all of its limitations, Filmation were able to constantly deliver the goods, albeit in a limited fashion. I've often said to people that when you watch the introduction of a Filmation cartoon, you know exactly how the episode itself will look. Plus, even though Tokyo Movie Shinsha could animate an explosion like no other, Filmation were way ahead of every other studio in the 80s when it came to special effects. When all is said and done, I love the fact that Tokyo Movie Shinsha were employed by Filmation this one time. For me, personally, it's the opportunity to see what happens when two of the biggest animation studios in the world team up. And you know what? The end result was pretty damn good. And that's it for this video. Thank you for watching. Please be sure to like, comment, share and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.